Hey there, Mike Robbins here, and I am coming to you live via our StreamYard platform on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. So, welcome. Grateful to have you join us today. Join me. I'm going to be talking about pillar number 2 from my new book, We're All in This Together. And that pillar is called Focus on Inclusion and Belonging. So if you are, hey Cash, good to see you. If you're joining live on whatever platform you're watching this on, LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube, feel free to just chime in on the comments. Hello there, good to see you. I should be able to see most of you, see your names. Would love to have a bit of a dialogue here as much as we can. This is my third time going live in the last 3 weeks, and in the subsequent weeks, I'm going to go live at least once a week and talk about pillars 3 and pillar 4. So my book, We're All in This Together, came out a few months ago, and we talked about pillar number 1 last week, which was create psychological safety. Today, we're going to focus on pillar number 2, which is focus on inclusion and belonging. Pillar 3 is embrace sweaty palm conversations, and pillar 4 is care about and challenge each other. So I'm going live here today. What is it? It's about 10:30, 10:31. Hey, Bo, good to see you. On Tuesday, the 29th of September. If you're watching this after the fact, feel free to chime in and leave some comments below. But let's talk about inclusion and belonging. So one of the main reasons that I wrote We're All in This Together and wanted it to come out in 2020, not knowing it was going to come out in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of this intense time of social and racial reckoning in our country here in the United States, but just knowing how divisive things have become in our country, in our world, I really wanted to write a book that was about, yes, it's about teamwork and about creating a culture of high performance, trust, and belonging, but also really look at how can we find common ground with each other in an authentic way? How can we confront some of the challenges that we face in all different aspects of our world, but particularly how things can break down along the lines of race, of gender, of orientation, of socioeconomics, of religion. So I wrote my 4th book, Bring Your Whole Self to Work, came out back in 2018. And as I was traveling around the country and around the world talking about that book and talking about authenticity and bringing your whole self to work, I had a number of people say things to me in different ways. But one of the consistent pieces of feedback that I got, which I appreciated, although at first I had a little bit of a defensive reaction to, hey, Zach, good to see you. Appreciate you joining and your kind words, was people would say, Mike, it's easy for you to talk about bringing your whole self to work. You're white, you're straight, you're male, you're cisgendered, you live in California, in the Bay Area, you're non-disabled. You have all of these privileges that other people don't have. So it's a different conversation about bringing your whole self to work for those of us who aren't as privileged as you. And look, when I first got this feedback, it's not as though I didn't understand what people were saying or didn't get it to the degree that I could. I mean, part of my background, as you may know, I grew up in Oakland, raised by a single mom, went to inner city schools growing up, was often, especially by junior high and high school, and particularly in sports, was often one of the only, if not the only kid that looked like me. I was the only white kid on the basketball team and in the entire basketball league when I was at Skyline High School in Oakland. When I went to Stanford for college, in addition to playing baseball, I got my degree in American Studies with a specialization in race and ethnicity, issues of race, issues of diversity, issues of, raised by a feminist mother and an older sister who got her degree in African American Studies at Wesleyan, also studied feminist studies. I mean, again, these things have been and continue to be important in my life. And growing up and then living in a diverse place like the San Francisco Bay Area, again, not that I'm unaware. I say all of that because when people would say this thing about being privileged, I remember at first having a bit of a reaction, like privilege, like my notion of privilege a few years ago, when people would say that, even though people were starting to talk more about white privilege and male privilege, in my mind, I thought about like, that means you're like a Rockefeller or something, right? I literally, the kid who sat next to me at graduation at Stanford in American Studies was a Rockefeller from the Rockefeller family. So when I think of privilege, I'm thinking of like born with a silver spoon in your mouth, super wealthy, well-connected, right? But as I've learned more in the last few years, especially, and as we've started to understand more about privilege, it's like, no, white privilege or privilege in general doesn't mean, I mean, yes, if you're a Rockefeller, you've got some privilege, clearly, probably more than most of us. But one of the things that's super important in talking about how do you build a strong team culture and organizational culture, and how do we influence the culture in the country and the world in which we live, is we have to first really grapple with the inequities and particularly privilege. Now, look, all of us have privilege to some degree. Some of us clearly have more. It's not simply just white people or male people or wealthy people or people in positions of power and authority. Those are clearly aspects of privilege. But when I was researching for this particular chapter, when I was writing We're All in This Together last spring, last summer, I found something, a story online that really resonated with me. It was from a high school teacher who shared how he teaches about privilege to his high school students. And I thought this was really poignant. So he said, basically, he gives all the kids in the class, they're all sitting in rows in the class, a piece of scrap paper, and says, I'd like you to crumple this paper up into a ball. And then he said, I put a garbage can in front of the class right up by the board, and I say, this can represents success, making it in our, American sort of capitalistic culture. And everybody's got a shot. So what I'd like for you to do, all basically at the same time from your seats, throw your ball, your crumpled up ball, into the can. And if you make it, you made it. Congratulations. If you miss, sorry, you missed. Okay, so everybody got the instructions. Okay, we're going to do it. And he says, as he explains it, and as he says, everybody go, immediately what happens, as you can imagine, some of the kids start complaining, particularly the kids far in the back of the class or way off to the side that are furthest away from the can. And as they start complaining and grumbling, hold on, this isn't fair, and this isn't fair, he stops the class. He says, okay, now what's happening? Look, this is the land of opportunity. This is the land of, everyone's got a shot. But the reality is some people's shots are more difficult than others. And he says, I asked the class, notice who's complaining the most. The people who have the most difficult shot. And he said, and those of you right up front, it's not a slam dunk. You still have, 8 or 10 feet. You got to, but your first thought probably wasn't like, oh, I wonder what it's like for the people in the back, or can I help them out? It was, how am I going to make this? He said, this is privilege. And so he said, I end the lesson by explaining that education is a privilege that not everybody in the world has access to. And one of the things we can choose to do with our privilege is use it to benefit those who might have less privilege than we do. So you can do that with your education. Now, when I read this, I thought, wow, what a great way to explain and really exemplify privilege in a non-political, non-sort of racial, gender oriented way, if you will. The term privilege, white privilege, male privilege, just privilege in general, is become like almost a slur as opposed to just a reality that some of us have more privilege than others. And so in terms of focusing on inclusion and belonging in the context of my book, We're All in This Together, in the context of the team that maybe you lead or you're a part of, or any team or group that you're a part of, your organization, your family, a church group, a community group, what we have to look at is the importance of, yes, first and foremost, we need to have that psychological safety that we talked about last week, which is group trust. The group is safe enough for people to speak up, take a risk, be themselves. But ultimately, then the next layer, the next pillar is focusing on inclusion and belonging. Now, look, the difference, if we talk about diversity, diversity is about different voices and people at the table, representation from as many groups as possible, backgrounds, perspectives, races, genders, orientations. And look, that stuff, that's super important on so many levels. And Look, here's what we know. McKinsey did a study a few years ago called Delivering Through Diversity that I talk about in the book. And what they found was that gender diverse teams outperform their peers by 21%, and ethnically diverse teams outperform their peers by 33%. So diversity is not simply just a good thing to do, the right thing to do, a nice thing to do. It actually has an impact in terms of the performance of our team. But not all of us are in positions to hire or promote. Now, some of us may be. So if you are in a position to hire and promote, it's important to fill the pipeline with as many diverse candidates as possible so that you ultimately get the best person for the job, but that your team and your company can be as representative of your customer base, of the world at large as possible. Now, inclusion, Renee Myers, who's the head of inclusion and diversity at Netflix and has been studying this and writing about it as a thought leader on diversity, inclusion, and equity, very well known. She has a great quote that you may have heard of, and she said, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. So inclusion is about including people, creating environments that are as inclusive as possible. What that means is those of us who might find ourselves in positions of privilege, part of dominant groups, or in positions of authority, doing anything and everything we can to be as inclusive as possible, to acknowledge and own up to the privilege that we have and utilize it in the most positive way, and be aware of the biases that we bring, both consciously and unconsciously, that can potentially impact how included people feel or not. I mean, examples of this that I think about myself. Again, I mean, I'm white, I'm straight, I'm male, I'm cisgendered, I'm American, I live in California. I have a worldview, and as open-minded as I try to be, as aware as I try to be, emotionally aware, socially aware, culturally aware, I've got blind spots, some of which I'm aware of, many of which I'm not. Like whenever I step outside of California, and I'm not traveling much these days, as most of us aren't because of the pandemic, but whenever I step outside of the Bay Area, even other parts of the state or other parts of the country, or especially when I travel abroad, which again, I haven't done in a while, I'm immediately confronted by, oh, wow, there's a lot of different things going on here. I have a very American worldview. Looking at some of the things that maybe we're unaware of. There's an example that I share in the book as well. Michelle, my wife, and I were at a workshop a couple of years back, and the woman leading the workshop, it was actually a relationship workshop. So most of the couples there were heterosexual couples like us, men and women. And so she was talking about male-female dynamics. And she said, I'm going to ask the men a question, then I'm going to ask the women the same question, and I want you to answer. She said, I'm going to give you some time frames, and I want you to answer the question, when was the last time you felt physically unsafe? Was it in the last 10 years, the last 5 years, the last year? She's going down 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, 1 week, 24 hours. She asked, and she's just the men first, right? And all the guys in the room were raising our hands at different times. I think I raised my hand at some time in the last year. I remember feeling physically unsafe. I was on the road at an event for a speaking engagement in Washington, D.C. I went out with a friend for dinner, was coming back to my hotel, got lost, didn't know exactly where I was going. It was dark. I remember feeling scared, like for my safety. I eventually found my way back to the hotel, but I remember that night. Anyway, then she asked the women the same question. When was the last time you felt physically unsafe? And she said, again, just answer once, the time frame that's most accurate, 10 years, 5 years, a year, 6 months. The women are not raising their hands. And I'm like, why are they not raising their hands? I don't understand. 3 months, a month. Within the last week, a couple hands finally go up. Within the last 24 hours, she says, about 80% of the hands in the room, including Michelle's, my wife, sitting right next to me, go up. And at that moment, I look at Michelle and I'm like, when, where, what? And I'm looking around the room, and most of the men like me are going, what? Like, what is going on? And most of the women are looking at us like, how do you not know this? And the woman leading the workshop says, this is one of the fundamental differences between walking around the world in a male body versus walking around the world in a female body. And we almost never talk about it. So that's an example of a bias, unconscious bias that I have, or an unawareness of what would it be like as a woman just sitting in a meeting or talking about a topic or whatever, just as an example. And not every woman is the same. Obviously, not every man is the same. But inclusion is about trying to be more aware, more mindful, be more conscious about our biases, and do everything that we can to be as inclusive as possible in our language, in our thinking, in our decision making, in how we operate. Now, this is a imperfect process. This is messy. It's important though. And if we're going to create a healthy, strong team, a healthy, strong culture, we have to be able to focus on inclusion. Now, I noticed there's a few questions. Chris Hill, good to see you, man. Thanks for the questions. I want to acknowledge these. And if any of you watching, again, live on Facebook or on LinkedIn or on YouTube, feel free to chime in with comments. If you have questions after the fact, like you're watching this video after, you can chime in with questions because I'll go back and read through some of the comments. But Chris asks, how do we acknowledge those differences of opportunity while maintaining a certain standard? Do we hold everyone in the workplace to the same standard? Yes. Now, look, I think it's important that we realize not everybody starts at the same place. That said, if you look at, there's a lot of research and data out there about ways that you can fill the pipeline with as many diverse candidates as possible. And in that process, still hold the same high standard, pick the best person for the job, but make sure that there are diverse opportunities for people to even apply or put their hat in the ring, so to speak. Part of what we create these echo chambers, and we don't realize, oh, I need to reach outside of that. I need to look for different things. And a lot of what we know about hiring and about standards these days, for many years, it was like resume and where'd you go to school and we now know that those things matter. They're not unimportant, but they're not nearly as important as being the right fit for the job, being able to learn, being able to grow, being able to adapt. I mean, look at what's happened the last 6 months. How many of us were prepared to be leading or working in the midst of a pandemic? And how could you even hire for that? We've had to adapt, we've had to adjust. And then Chris also asked, how should we think about expectations and job performance as it relates to those differences of diversity? Look, I mean, I think at some level, and this is true, look, you could get, everybody could look the same race, same gender, same background, same all that. And people are going to perform at different levels. People are going to, right, have high standards for here's how we expect people to perform. And then there's the reality of how people actually perform. So we don't lower the standards for anybody. We simply just fill the team with as many diverse voices and perspectives and skill sets as possible, because that's going to make the best team. But thinking that we need to lower standards for people actually then devalues it for everybody. So that's not necessary. And we might have to get really creative and be really proactive about making sure we're creating as diverse of a team as possible. Look, I mean, part of it, there is some research that I found too. Just think about mentorship and sponsorship. It's a really high percentage of people that only mentor other people who look like them. And it's usually not conscious. It's just, oh, I can relate to them better. We have more things in common. But that then creates a sense where not as many people are getting mentored. And sponsorship, different than mentorship, is about really advocating for people. So again, it's just being conscious of some of these things. So inclusion is about removing barriers that might get in the way of people feeling excluded. But now I was talking to Eric Severson and interviewed him on my podcast. I've actually had him on my podcast twice. Maybe you've had a chance to hear either of those interviews on my We're All in This Together podcast. But in the most recent interview that Eric and I did, which was early in 2019, Eric and I met years ago. He was the co-CHRO at Gap Inc., which is where we met and did some work together. He then, for a couple of years, was the chief people officer at DaVita and has since left DaVita and is now the chief people officer at Neiman Marcus. When I interviewed him in early 2019, he was still at DaVita. And we talked a lot about some of the really innovative things DaVita was doing specifically around diversity and inclusion, which Eric was a big advocate for. He's been a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion for many years. And now Eric happens to be male and happens to be white, but he's a member of the LGBTQ community. And he said something really interesting when I was interviewing him about this. He said, Mike, if you talk to most of us who self-identify as a member of one or more non-dominant or minority group, he said, and I think about this myself, as a gay man, I also think about this and with all the people that I've interviewed and researched and looked at and talked to about this. If you ask most of us, would we rather be included than excluded? Most of us would say, of course, I'd rather be included than excluded. He said, but that still creates the dynamic that there's an in-group and an out-group. He said, and while that, of course, exists in the world and in the business world, that still sets up that dynamic that the in-group is forced to include the out-group. And I still feel like an outsider who just happened to be invited in. He said, what I'd rather know, what most of us would rather know, is just that we belong here. So ultimately, and what I talk about in this particular chapter in the book, is that while diversity is fundamentally important on so many levels for performance, for so many other aspects, societally and otherwise, while inclusion is fundamental to make sure that people feel safe, they feel like they're part of the group and not excluded, ultimately the goal where we want to get to is a place of belonging. That everybody, regardless of background, identity, regardless of orientation and race and gender, regardless of level and role and experience and pedigree and all that stuff, that everyone knows, I belong here. I am a full participating member of this group, of this organization. And I can bring my whole self to work. I can be myself. Now look, the thing about belonging isn't just a nice to have. It's a need to have. It's a fundamental human need. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, we're all grappling with and dealing with certain aspects of Maslow's hierarchy. Given the pandemic and everything that's going on, the first level of Maslow's hierarchy is physiological. That means like I'm physiologically safe, like health and well-being. That's part of why with the pandemic, there's a threat to that. And we're like, oh, I got it, right? The second level of Maslow's hierarchy is safety. Safety, like, can I provide for myself and my family? I mean, these first two levels are really sort of base level survival aspects. Am I healthy and well? Are the people around me healthy and well? Do we have a place to live? Do we have a job? Do we have food to eat? I mean, those sort of physical and safety needs are fundamental. Look, it's why we wear masks and socially distant and put on our seatbelt in the car and look both ways before we cross the street and, you know, buy life insurance. I mean, that you on and on and on. You see, like you do that. We do that personally. Businesses need to do that. To, like why some businesses have had to furlough people and lay people off, as painful and challenging as that is, to both be on the receiving end of that, of course, but even to be communicating that news, to right size the business so we can survive. However, if you keep going up Maslow's hierarchy, you know what the third level, the third need is on the pyramid, you see it often listed as a pyramid, is belonging. We have a fundamental need to belong, to have that sense of connection, that sense of love, that sense of social interaction. Part of the challenge of being disconnected and working virtually is that it's harder to feel like we really belong or we're connected in that same way because we're not together physically. I mean, some of us may be getting together socially distant and otherwise, and then if you keep moving up Maslow's hierarchy, it goes to esteem, which is the fourth, and the fifth is self-actualization. So yes, the base ones are fundamental and need to be in place before we can move up the pyramid. But look, that means that every single one of us both has a need to belong, and we've also experienced both belonging and not belonging. Now, look, clearly some of us, for a variety of reasons, not simply just our identity, how we look and our background and where we come from, but that's a big piece of it, have experienced not belonging. And some of us, if we're in a dominant group like I am, and maybe you are, maybe you find it's just more of a given, you feel as though you belong. But ultimately, it's about consciously choosing to create an environment that's not only inclusive, but really focuses on belonging. And what's interesting about this, when I talk to a lot of people, and I talk to people who look like me and people who don't look like me, what I often hear about this is a couple of things. And there's probably a bunch of things that I don't hear or don't know, just given my perspective and my own identity. But I hear things like, okay, from people who don't look like me, I often hear, why do I always have to bring this up? Or it's, you know, I'm a woman, I'm a person of color, I'm part of this group or that group or these multiple non-dominant groups, and it's, I either don't feel safe or it's hard to do, or again, that back to that, it's easier for you to bring your whole self to work. I don't always want to be the one. How come I'm the only woman on this team and I'm always bringing up aspects of gender dynamics and that's exhausting and that's tiring. I'm the only Black person on this team. How come I have to continually educate people on systemic racism and I'm the whatever? Or maybe I'm not the only, but I'm just like, so we all got to do our work. And then I hear from people who do look like me. It's usually either I'm not totally aware of these things or paying attention, like me at the example at that workshop about what it's like to be a woman. Even someone who thinks I have a wife and two daughters and was raised by a single mom and an older sister and have Not like I've never thought about. I think quite a bit about gender and gender dynamics, but that was like, oh, wow, there's obviously lots of things. I have no idea what it's like to be female. So we're either not aware of it, or I am aware that these things exist, or I see all what's going on, and people are in the streets, and people are protesting, and people are posting on social media, and people are talking, and there's a lot of emotion. I want to do something, say something, engage in some way that's helpful, but I'm afraid. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? What if I put my foot in my mouth? What if I come across as racist or sexist or homophobic or insensitive? Brene Brown talked about this in her Netflix special that came out last year. I forget the name of it. Anyway, it's great. Just look up Brene Brown on Netflix. She's fantastic. Her work is phenomenal. It's had a big impact on my work and my life. But she said not talking about issues of diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging because they make us uncomfortable is the epitome, is the definition of privilege. I don't want to talk about it. Makes me feel uncomfortable, makes me feel bad, or I feel guilty, or I feel weird, or right? I saw a post on social media recently that said learning about racism is much easier than experiencing it. So it's a privilege to be educated about these things versus have to actually deal with them. So Zach asked a good question. How do we remove guilt/innocence as an impetus for inclusion? Like asking someone to dance because you feel guilty that they're alone versus because you genuinely want to dance with them. That's a great question, Zach. I would say, look, I mean, using the dance example, just using that metaphor, if you see someone is alone by themselves, if you're going to ask them to dance because you feel guilty that they're dancing or they're standing alone, it's a little bit of pity. It's a little bit of, there's more of a negative motivation for that. If you're, hey, I see that person seems like they would like to dance, or what could I do to go ask them and include them? Not out of pity, not out of guilt, but out of a desire to want people to be included. Look, a more practical example of this, just think about team meetings. And now we're meeting mostly on Zoom or on Skype or on Microsoft Teams or some, Blue Jeans or Google Meet or whatever the heck, right? We're meeting. So, but this is true when we were meeting in person. It's like, there are certain people that don't speak up as much. And maybe you're a leader. Do you include them in the conversation? Do you bring them into the conversation? Not by calling them out, but what do you think, Susie? What do you think, Joe? What do you think, Jose? What do you think, Maria? What do you think, LaShonda? Whoever it is, right? Or we haven't heard from a couple, or just being inclusive, getting people involved, getting people engaged. If you find yourself in a leadership or management position, making sure we're not just steamrolling through decisions without having people weigh in. And in some cases, you could argue, well, hey, people need to be responsible, need to be grown-ups. They need to speak up if they have something to say. Yes, absolutely. That person really wants to dance. They should come and just start dancing even by themselves. You could say that, but at the same time, if we're in a position of privilege, of power, of authority, it could even just be, it doesn't always have to be about race or even positional, but let's just say, so our girls are both going to new schools this year, middle school, high school, new schools. We don't know people in the community. They don't have a ton of friends. I've appreciated the people from the school, like the staff, as well as some of the parents. It's only been a few, and everybody's busy and their plates are really full, who've reached out to us proactively to try to be as inclusive as possible. Now, we've also reached out and said, hey, we want to engage. And again, so it's a two-way street. But if you have any privilege in particular, and other people have less, you don't have to, but you could absolutely utilize that as a way to try to be as inclusive and welcoming to the people around you. And if we're building the culture of a team, this is really fundamental. So I'm going to wrap up here in just a minute, give you a few specific things to think about in this regard. But if there are any other questions or comments or thoughts that anybody wants to share or ask who's joining live, whether you're on LinkedIn or on Facebook or on YouTube, feel free to just use the comment section and chime in with a question or a thought. It's great to see some of you, Teresa and Chris and Zach and Ray, Bo, Cash, some of the others who've joined. I appreciate it. So a couple things that you can do. First and foremost, with respect to inclusion and belonging, understand the difference between diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and focus on all three based on whatever privilege or influence you have. Second thing is acknowledge the privilege that you have and the bias that you have. Those things aren't bad. You're not wrong. You're not evil. You're just human, and you occupy the space and the role and the identity that you occupy. The more aware of your own privilege and your own bias, the more effective you're going to be at being inclusive and ultimately creating an environment of belonging. And then the third thing that I would say, and this sort of is a little bit of a segue into pillar number 3, which we're going to talk about next week, is be willing to have uncomfortable conversations about some of these topics. Be willing to ask questions. Be willing to engage. Be willing to listen, to learn. Yes, it's messy. Yes, you'll mess it up. Yes, you'll say the wrong thing. Yes, inevitably, even if you don't mean to, you will offend someone. But another thing that Brene Brown says that I love in regards to conversations around race and gender and orientation and diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging is, I'm here to get it right, not to be right. I'm here to get it right, not to be right. So can we all show up with a little more compassion, a little more authenticity, a little more courage, attempting to get it right, not be right? When we do that, not only do we learn and we grow, but we can create an even more inclusive environment and a team and a group where people genuinely feel like they belong. So this is pillar number 2 from my new book, We're All in This Together. Thank you for joining. I will put a few comments down below. And it looks like Marcus, this is your first time here. Thanks for joining. Yeah, I spoke at your Nutrient Safety Summit. So thanks for that. I'll put a few links in the comments. You can connect with me on our website, which is mike-robbins.com, and would love to hear more from you. Comments, questions, ideas, thoughts for other lives. Again, I'll be coming live again next week around this same time, either Tuesday or Wednesday, to talk about pillar 3, about embracing sweaty palm conversations. And then the following week, pillar 4, caring about and challenging each other. And then I'm going to plan on coming on live about once a week to address some of what's going on in the country, in the world, and how we can show up as even more effective leaders and human beings. And remember, we're all in this thing together. Thanks for joining. Take care.